Hey guys. So this is, as promised, the top 100 vocab words for APUSH. This is gonna be like a rapid fire of these questions with definition and significance. They are gonna be in chronological order. So let's go. Before I start this, I do want to have like this disclaimer that this is not all the vocab words that, can show up on the test or that you should even study. My big pictures questions with first tier vocab words study guide, that lengthy title one that's been posted on Canvas since March. That is the one to look at. That has all of these golden terms that I'll be discussing, plus other high frequency terms that have shown up on the exam before that are not specifically name dropped in the College Board curriculum, but have shown up numerous times and therefore are really worth studying. And so like that list is more, in like a couple hundred as opposed to this 100, but that would set you up more for success than just sticking to these 100. So I really want to put that out there as a disclaimer that sticking to this it would be a huge mistake to only rely on these 100 terms to get you by. But you have to know these, so let's go. All right, first one, maize. It's corn. So why is it significant? Basically, having stable crops is the number one factor that would determine the lifestyle and organization of any Native American tribe. If you were able to have agriculture, then you create a permanent settlement. And if you had a permanent settlement, you could create a more complex society. So we see that corn specifically, or maize, was the number one like stable crop that allowed for those, like the dominoes to fall to create more complex societies. Columbian Exchange. All right, so after conquistadors and other explorers settled here in the Americas, the Columbian Exchange is that permanent now transfer of plants, goods, peoples, ideas, diseases, animals, everything good and bad in between the Americas and Europe. Later, when we also add in the third leg to Africa to pick up slaves to bring to the Americas, that will also be considered like the triangle trade, where that last leg of the journey from Africa to the Americas is considered, or it's called the Middle Passage. But the Columbian Exchange is that permanent now connection and relationship between the old world and the new world. And both have been permanently altered forever, not necessarily equally. The old world, which is Europe, has a lot more positive experiences because with the exchange of the hardy crops such as corn and potatoes that make their way back over to Europe, they experience a lot more of a steady population growth because of those hardy crops. And in the Americas, we have more of the disease that they were not their bodies had not been previously exposed to, so wiped out a lot of the native population. They do bring over horses, and so some native tribes are able to domesticate horses to help with their hunting of big game. But other than that, a lot of the other effects in the New World aren't as great. And communist system. All right, speaking of not so great effects. All right, so this is the slave system that was developed by the Spanish conquistadors. This is clearly not supported by the natives, as seen as the Pueblo Revolt, which is one of the largest native rebellions in the New World. And the justification for this by the Spanish in like documents that go back to the monarch is that this is more so presented as a an equal trade-off because they're giving them labor and they're also giving them like Christian education, essentially. And that's their justification for how they could validate having this essentially slave labor, not essentially, it is slave labor, and how that can be in accordance with their Catholic beliefs. So this does show the negative impact of European exploration, as we discussed. It reflects the clear economic goals that European explorers had for going out into the New World, because they're using these as a form of labor, mainly to work on sugar plantations. And this is also what gives way to like the Valladolid debate with Bartholomew de las Casas, who argues that this very same thing as I just said, that how is this necessarily, how can we reconcile the existence of this along with our religious beliefs? Mercantilism. So this is an economic policy that aims at exporting more than you import, right? You want to sell more than you're buying. Makes sense. However, that thought process is a major motivation for creating colonies, because colonies not only help give you raw materials to create your products, but they also act as a great dumping ground for you to sell off your products and make a lot of money off of them. So this economic policy is a huge incentive for colonization. Salutary neglect. So this is the relaxed relationship that Great Britain had with its colonies prior to the French and Indian War. After, it will be very different because something has changed, and we'll discuss that later. England is like one of the only colonizers that has that kind of relationship with their colonies, whereas like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, they are way more hands-on. We're more like the chill parent that's like, all right, as long as you have good grades, you do you. But like we said, something changes later. But the significance of this is that this type of lax relationship allows for the colonies to have a lot more sense of greater autonomy in building their own local communities, their own local governments, their own ideas, and creating more of a unique American identity separate from Great Britain. Again, I don't want you guys to think that they're thinking of independence. That's not even on their radar. But they've had that kind of sense of autonomy, which makes them more confident and likely to speak out and rebel against Great Britain. Again, going back to like the thinking of parenting and children analogy, if you've operated not like on your own, but independently to some degree with your parents, that once they try to crack down at some point, you're like, no. As opposed to if you've already always had a helicopter parent, you're like, sir, yes, sir. So very different relationship between English colonies and their mother country, and how that changes down the line once Great Britain is like, no, we need to crack down. Indentured servitude. So this, along with the headright system, are passed around the same time, and these are specifically for the Chesapeake colonies, the Chesapeake region. As I mentioned in class, the whole reason why we care about New England and Chesapeake is that they are two regions, early regions that act as case studies for why the rest of the United States really develops as it does. The New England being the whole northern half, and the Chesapeake being the future southern half, and how their societies are greatly different based on a few key factors: the climate and geography that determine their economy, and the demographics of people that came over that influence the values of their society. You had New England come over as Puritan religious families fleeing from persecution, and because of their religious and family ties, they have close-knit communities that value egalitarian beliefs, whereas Chesapeake come over as joint stock companies with like single men looking to make money, and they're not there to flee Great Britain, so they're more tied to them. They're more culturally similar to them, they're more loyal to them, but they have those same kind of economic beliefs baked into their society because that's why they were founded. And their economy is based on agriculture because that's what their climate allowed for. And so pair that together, that requires a big labor supply. And that's where you see the headright system and indentured servitude. So indentured servitude is a contract labor system where your fare across the Atlantic was paid for by your future master. And I say master because you were basically their slave, their worker for a contract period of time, which could be anywhere between like 4 and 7 years. And then at the end of that, you would get like these dues that you were owed, like you get some payment, and then you're off on your own. However, most people didn't even make it to the end of their contract. That's how rough it was. So this reflects that it reflects those economic goals of Chesapeake and how that differed from New England. It is one of the ways that not just the rich could eventually make their way over to the colonies. So it helped kind of increase that, migration across the Atlantic. But once again, it allows us to see the stark differences between New England and Chesapeake, where Chesapeake has those economic goals and social hierarchy and social divisions where not everyone is the same. Town meetings. Going off that same thread, that through line of thinking about how New England and Chesapeake are different, town meetings were the form of local government seen in New England. Like I said, they are more family-based, they're more religious-based, and so their politics are more centered around the church. And they had town meetings where, you'd go to church, and then afterwards you have a communal meeting with everyone, and everyone kind of had an equal say in community problems. It's way more egalitarian, it's way more democratic. And so, like I said, it just helps us see those differences and why those two regions developed differently the way they did. Also, not just New England versus Chesapeake, but America versus Great Britain. It's an early sign of democracy in the colonies. We have the Mayflower Compact. We have the We have town meetings, even the House of Burgesses that is in Chesapeake, while that still is very classist because it's got like an upper house and a lower house, and only people who own property could be part of that. You could still be elected into those positions, where Parliament in Great Britain, they did not have those kind of elections. So it still shows more democracy in the colonies than Great Britain. So town meetings can also serve as evidence for that. The Enlightenment. So this is an intellectual movement beginning in Europe, trickles over to the colonies just throughout time, makes its way into the colonies in like the early 1700s. It stressed progressive thinking, using logic and rationale to think of the world. I don't want you guys to think that these people are like all atheists and they're all anti-religion. It's just more so thinking about it critically, maybe not taking it as literally, more as like stories. But I digress. It's more of an intellectual movement, but how it's significant to American history. It made people question the role of government and economic systems like mercantilism, and how that doesn't seem like a natural relationship. It's not symbiotic. And so it will later inspire the revolution. The French and Indian War. All right, so the war fought in North America between French and British colonies is basically like a proxy war, that they are having beef of their own over supremacy in North America, and they're using their colonies to duke it out on their behalf. They both send their maybe reinforcements of their own soldiers over. They ally themselves with whatever native tribes they're most close with, and we duke it out over that Western land in that like Northwest region, like the Ohio River Valley, some people refer to it as, for dominance in the area. And the American colonies win. It ends with the Treaty of Paris, or the Peace of Paris of 1763. And we get all of the land up into the Mississippi River. The French colonies are goodbye from North America for now. And so there are a lot of lasting effects for this war, and why it's such a significant turning point in American history. A lot of effects. Colonies gained a lot of confidence in themselves by fighting in this war. They gained a lot of fighting experience. In order to fight the war, they had to set up a lot of intercolonial communication systems and transportation networks, when before they had like nothing to do with each other. But this is the first unifying experience they really had. Great Britain has unchallenged supremacy in North America, and they created an enemy in the French, who will later aid us in the revolution, partly because of this. But the biggest takeaway here is all of the debt that Great Britain is left with as a result of fighting in this war. And they believe, the Whigs in Parliament believe, that the colony should bear the burden of forking over the money to pay off the debt in the war. And there is an abrupt end of salutary neglect, and that's where we see the increase in taxation, which leads us to the Stamp Act. This is the first direct tax placed on the colonies. So taxes have been placed on the colonies before, but direct meaning that it is seen and felt by the colonists. Direct tax is like when you pay for it at the store, like a sales tax, you see it how it's tacked on, which is way more insulting and infuriating, as opposed to the fact that like that the Walgreens I'm buying my pop at, before I even buy it with the sales tax, they already had to pay taxes for it and fees to get that there. And so they were already charged maybe that same tax on the back end, and they just raised the price of the good, and then I bought it. And so that's not necessarily something that I would think about or see. I just see the cost of the good, apart from the sales tax. But when it's like a sales tax, it's like tacked on to the cost that you're already seeing up front. That's what we call a direct tax. And that's way more infuriating and way more noticeable and visible to the colonists. And so the Stamp Act was like where you see this huge turn in the colonists' willingness to speak out against the British government, because they already were upset about the proclamation of 1763. However, they just ignored that. And the navigation acts that were passed for mercantilism before, they just smuggled and lied and got away with it and weren't really paying attention to it. But with this crackdown of the British being like, we need money to pay for this war, and it's up to you to do it, we're going to have a lot more close monitoring. Now all of a sudden they're really pissed. And so this began the no taxation without representation. And where they want representation? In Parliament, because that is who's taxing them. It's not just taxes in general. They're being taxed by their local governments all the time, but they have representation there. They voted for those individuals. And so they're not upset about that. And so we start seeing a lot more colonial rebellion. We see the formation of the Stamp Act Congress, which is the prelude to the Continental Congress and then later actual Congress. The formation of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, who's the huge revolutionary group that creates a lot of literature to rile up people, like the Boston Massacre painting, the committees of correspondence, letters from a American farmer, all that kind of stuff. They orchestrate economic boycotts, and everything in between. All right, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. This is a revolutionary book that argued it's common sense to rebel against an oppressive government. So this is basically a revolutionary piece of literature that is dripping with Enlightenment influence. And it really inspires the colonists because he's basically saying that, yes, this relationship is between us and Great Britain is unnatural. We're not benefiting from it. The government should work on behalf of us, not the other way around. Kind of that social contract idea from the Enlightenment. And so this is where we start seeing the idea of independence being brought up. It was not on the colonist radar this entire time. The College Board loves to trick students with that, thinking that people are always demanding independence. They weren't. They were even sending like the olive branch petition, like up until the 11th hour. They were always trying to just be like, we recognize that you have authority over us, but like we just want representation. And then once Thomas Paine's Common Sense comes out right at the end, that's when people were like, I honestly don't know if there's any other way around this than actually independence. So it started to switch that kind of like lingering thought in the back of people's heads, like, what else could we do to independence being the true goal? Republican motherhood. So it is the belief during and after the revolution that women have this moral duty as kind of the moral epicenter of the household and the rear of the children, that it's their duty to pass on American values to their kids, specifically republicanism, democracy, freedom, all those Enlightenment ideas that they're fighting for. And so why do we care about this? Because one, it just shows what America stands for at this time, but two, it's all about women. It shows an increase in women's status and role in society. Shays Rebellion. So there are 3 farmer rebellions that you guys need to know: Bacon, Shays, and Whiskey. They're all very close to each other in history. They are all farmer rebellions that highlight class divisions. However, there is something that we kind of learn from each of them, because like Bacon's rebellion in the Chesapeake region, once again, highlights those class divisions. Like that's evidence of. Because they are indentured servants and like low-class farmers. And then Shays and Whiskey are like 2 sides of the same coin. The Shays Rebellion is a rebellion of farmers in the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation, and they're upset about the debt from the American Revolution because this is Massachusetts, and the New England colonies took on most of the fighting during the Revolution. They were most of the patriots, whereas the South was most of the loyalists, because they're culturally tied to Great Britain more, economically tied to them more, all that stuff. And so the lack of the government's ability to do anything with the farmers in Massachusetts just overtaking the courthouse made people go like, maybe this government is too weak, and maybe we need to give it more power. And so it motivated the country to revising the Articles of Confederation and giving more power. All right, so let's talk about what the Articles of Confederation are. All right, so the Articles of Confederation were our first form of federal government. It was purposely kept extremely weak and tiny to prevent tyranny, learning from our experiences with Great Britain. So it had very little wins. They were able to organize the Western land with the Northwest Ordinance and Land Ordinance, how we can like plot and divide and sell off that land. It helped encourage westward settlement. Great. However, basically an L in all the other areas. It made it very difficult to pass legislation because you needed 9 out of 13 votes and then a unanimous vote in order to amend the articles. They were not given the ability to force states to basically do anything. Like they couldn't get them to fight in a war. They couldn't get them to agree or follow a treaty. Like there was no executive branch because there was only one branch, which is the Congress. It's the legislative branch. They just write laws, and there's nothing there for the colonies to be like, oh yeah, I have to follow that because if I don't, this thing will happen. There's nothing. There's no executive branch. There's nothing. So with that, it's really hard for the federal government to navigate any key issues in society, and all these realizations of like, especially with Shays Rebellion, inspire them to write the Constitution the way it was. So it's the failings of the articles that you can see how its influence is in the Constitution. Bill of Rights. All right, so at the Constitutional Convention, and they're hashing out all these compromises that have to happen, like the commercial compromise, the Electoral College, all that kind of stuff. The Great Compromise. The Bill of Rights is one of the most prominent ones. It is the first 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution that are all aimed at protecting your individual liberties. It was added to make the anti-federalists feel better because anti-federalists are anti-federal government. They are nervous about giving too much power to the federal government. They probably would have preferred keeping the Articles of Confederation as is. Because they're so scared about potential tyranny. They're like, you know what? Why can't it just be left up to the people and the states? But this gives them a little bit more, you know, peace knowing that there is some kind of built-in protections. So why do we care about this? It shows those Enlightenment ideals again as American values. It shows the values of power to the people and democracy that America says it stands for. It's one of the first major arguments that led to the creation of the two parties over the role/power of the federal government. Great compromise. I just kind of alluded to this as one of the compromises that happened at the Constitutional Convention. So basically, while we were there, there was this discussion about representation in Congress because Congress is the most important branch. Let's not get fooled here. It's the reason why it's Article 1 in the Constitution. They wrote that it was the only branch under the Articles of Confederation, and it was the first branch written into the Constitution. So it is the starting point of everything. It's the heart of the country, and controls basically everything. And so every state wants more representation, more voices in Congress. But the question is, you have the Virginia plan that says it should be based on a population number, and New Jersey, where it's everyone's equal, like everyone should be able to send the same amount of people there. And they can't decide. And so that's what creates the bicameral or two-house Congress, where you have the House of Representatives, where it's based on population, and in the higher house, which is the Senate, where everyone's equal, everyone's got two. Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So we're zipping forward a little forward. So we got Washington, we've gone through Hamilton's financial plan, and now we're into John Adams and the wars ranging between France and Great Britain. And so John Adams, ultra-federalist, passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, which is like that first time in history where the president has passed something that everyone's like, I feel like that violates the Bill of Rights. And it states that he could like deport people that were considered alien, and just made it difficult to become more difficult to become a citizen, and sedition, meaning that you couldn't speak out against the government. And so in response to that were the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. So in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by John Adams, this states, this was written by James Madison and Jefferson. And it states that states should be able to nullify federal laws if they find them unconstitutional. And nullification, this is the first time that that was proposed. And that is why this is so significant. It's the first time that the federal government proposed something that violated the Bill of Rights, and that it seemed to like slide. So it set that precedent. And then it also sets the precedent for states being like, I actually think that we should nullify. Now, nothing came of this. They didn't actually nullify it, but it's the first time it's proposed, and it kind of sets that precedent. It lays that seed in the ground, to be grown later with the nullification crisis next. Marbury v. Madison. All right, Supreme Court case where Chief Justice John Marshall acted as head in deciding that one of John Adams' quote-unquote midnight judges, when he tried to elect a bunch of judges the night before he was supposed to be leaving office and Thomas Jefferson was supposed to be coming in, and Thomas Jefferson like stopped all the appointments, going like, no, you can't just shove all your people in before it's supposed to be my turn to come in. And one of the people that didn't get his appointments was Marbury, and so he sued and went all up to the Supreme Court. But it's not even really about whether he should get his job or not. It's that fact that John Marshall and the other justices went like, you know what? We're arguing if this guy should even get his job or not. But the Judiciary Act of 1789, the law that even gave Adams the ability to appoint him, I actually don't know if that's in accordance with the Constitution. And that was revolutionary. It freaked everyone out because like, oh my gosh, because in the Constitution, it says nothing about the Supreme Court checking federal laws. It's about state laws. And so they basically went ahead and were like, I'm going to declare that federal law unconstitutional. And by doing that, it gave them a new power, which is judicial review. The fact that they could declare a federal law unconstitutional. And everyone was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess they have that power. Monroe Doctrine. All right, in the era of good feelings after the War of 1812, so our first war as a nation, which we fought against Great Britain because they weren't respecting us. It was like the Revolution 2.0. And again, they are like the biggest baddie in the world right now. And so the fact that it become basically ends in a stalemate, in a draw, and we didn't lose, we had this newfound optimism, pride, confidence, whatever in our country. And that's the era of good feelings after the war. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big example of that. Basically, we are so self-inflated at this point that we're like puffing on our chest and we're like, yeah, guess what? Europe, we're going to not take any more of your influence on our side of the world. We're not going to tolerate any more European colonization or meddling in our side of the world. You stay on your side of the world, we'll stay on ours. We had no business saying that. We're very cocky when we deliver this. But this basically became the foundation of our isolationist foreign policy for the next 100 years, but it also sets a precedent or a standard for when we're willing to break isolationism. And we just said, we're not going to tolerate any future influence or meddling or colonization. Market revolution. All right. So an effect of the first industrial revolution in the early 1800s, one of the reasons that the first industrial revolution came about was the War of 1812. When Great Britain blockaded all of New England, we're like, all right, I guess we got to rise to the challenge. Let's start producing. And it rapidly industrialized New England. Like it spurred the northern states far ahead of the southern ones in the early 1800s. And so we see this switch of craftsmanship to technology and machinery to make stuff where you can mass produce it better. And so that's the Industrial Revolution, but the market revolution is different. A market revolution is the effect of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is just switching to the technology, like the introduction of technology. The market revolution is, okay, how does the introduction of that technology transform our society? How does it change how we live and do work? And so that is how you basically see that like the lull system in New England, the fact that like technology or the Industrial Revolution would be like the creation of that the spinning loom for textiles, but then the market revolution would be like the lull system where you have young unmarried women live and work in the business in order to produce more. That's the difference between industrial versus market revolution. So the market revolution completely transformed American society, changing the North and South very differently. It does create one unified national economy because we start creating more technology and infrastructure to link all of us together. It allows regions to specialize more, and then you can just ship your stuff to each other one. It gave more opportunities for women, like I said, in small doses, like the Lowell system. It gave different opportunities for African Americans because this is where the cotton gin is created. And so that increased the demand for slaves. So it's like not necessarily an opportunity, but it does change their life. It does increase the standard of living for everyone. So market revolution is more so how is society transformed as a result of the technology from the Industrial Revolution. And I know I just mentioned this, but let's talk about it more. Cotton gin. A technological invention by Eli Whitney, also with his interchangeable parts, during the first Industrial Revolution that made it a lot easier to pick and separate cotton. Significance, greatly increased the demand for slaves. I know it sounds ironic because it's like, well, if it makes it easier, then you should need less slaves. Isn't that the good thing? No, they think about it as I can just pick more faster. I need more slaves to make more money. Nativism. All right, this is the belief that native-born people are superior to immigrants. This came about in the early to mid 1800s when we have our first wave of immigrants coming over, which are the German and Irish, that are coming over for economic opportunities and freedom. We don't talk about so much of the push factors, like we'll push them out of their home countries, but the pull country of the first industrial revolution, or the pull factor of the first industrial revolution and job opportunities, and just our reputation for being a land of the free is are two major reasons. An example of nativism is the formation of the Know Nothing Party or the American Party that discriminated against immigrants and would attack their places of residency and places of work and try to just shove them out of society. This showed a change in the definition of what it means to be a quote unquote American because these are immigrants. And so basically being confronted with people that are different from us, it helped redefine what we current Americans in this time period define as who's American, what is American, and what's not. Universal male suffrage. In the 1830s, the repealing of property and religious qualifications to vote, allowing all white men to be able to vote. This was a major example of Jacksonian democracy after his election in 1828. So when he was elected, he ushered in a wave of democracy. There are so many other democratic practices like party nominating conventions and things like that, um, that just allow more people to have more positions in government and to switch out more frequently and just have more voices being heard. So this greatly increased democracy, as I said, especially power to the common man. It changed the relationship between the government officials and the public, who could hold them more accountable because now they have to cater more to you. And we could see this in the log cabin hard cider campaign in the election of 1840. The fact that they have to now have popular campaigning techniques to cater to the common man. It definitely shows a shift in the power dynamic where it's not all concentrated in the elites. The common man has way more power than ever before. Nullification crisis. So under Andrew Jackson, South Carolina's mouth of the South, John Calhoun, argued to nullify the tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations. It was passed under Jackson's predecessor. And he believed that Jackson would do this because he's like one of those good old boys of the South. He's, that Democratic Republican, who would in theory be on John Calhoun's side here. But as John Calhoun is saying that, yeah, we should just nullify the tariff, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Jackson's kind of like, okay, do I side with the people that I would probably agree with, but I'm also president and I'm responsible for the federal government. Should I let him just challenge the federal government's authority like that? And so in this situation, he goes, no, I'm not going to let him challenge the federal government like that. So I'm going to choose the side of, cracking down. So he actually was so close to sending a military to South Carolina to force them to pay this tariff until Henry Clay comes in with a compromise and proposes a lower tariff. And so this was all crisis averted, but still hugely significant. So it illustrates the economic and political divide between the northern industrial and southern agricultural economies. This tariff is a tale as old as time. We saw it initially with Hamilton's financial plan of why that benefited Northerners in every sense. And then because, National Bank is more likely to give loans out to northern businesses, not southern farmers. Tariffs that make there's a tax on foreign products, so it makes foreign products more expensive, and encourages you to buy American. That benefits northern businesses, not southern farmers who have to buy basically everything and import a lot of stuff. And so they did not like it with Hamilton's financial plan and Henry Clay's American system, which is like Hamilton's plan 2.0 during this time in the era of good feelings. It was just proposed. And once again, they're still arguing, yeah, tariffs only benefit northern states at the expense of southern states. And so it makes sense why South Carolina is like, get rid of this. It's punitive to us for no reason. And so it highlights that division in political economic interests. And it's another example, once again, of how nullification gets brought up and how states versus federal government power, which is going to lead into the Civil War in a couple decades. Whigs. Formerly Federalists who disappeared after the War of 1812 because it wasn't cute to be identified as a Federalist because they were arguing against the War of 1812 because they were like, please don't make our only trade partner mad at us. Makes sense why Federalists in the business northern area wouldn't be anti-war, but it looked, like I said, not cute, looked unpatriotic and undemocratic after the war that they were so anti-war that they just kind of like, ooh, okay, we're going to fade into the background. And so there was really only on paper one party that existed, the Democratic Republicans. And then they're going to eventually drop that and become Democrats. And they were those people that were Federalists, and they're still Federalists. They just don't have really a name for themselves. We're getting so frustrated with Andrew Jackson's policies, reemerge just under a new party name, and that is Whigs. So their birth was the recreation of the two-party system. Second Great Awakening. All right, so there's a first and a second Great Awakening. The first one's in the 1730s. The second one's 100 years later in the 1830s. They have the same goal of bringing people back from the church or back to the church. The first one was in reaction to the Enlightenment because the Enlightenment made people question things a little bit. So they're like, oh, no, please come back. Second Great Awakening is also trying to get people to come back to the church. Now, they both have very similar significance because as the first one, it was like just the first time that this happened and that they're like making religion more accessible to people that, you have the ability to save your own soul. It's in your hands. Predestination, just kidding. That's not a thing. So you really do have to come to church. That was actually really empowering. Like, oh, I have the ability to save my own soul. I can pray at home. I don't necessarily need to do it in front of a preacher. That was super empowering. And how that could also be misconstrued, or not misconstrued, but like thought of in other sectors like politics. I don't need to rely on the authority figure, or I can question the authority figure a little bit more, and how that could lead to the revolution. Fast forward 100 years later to the Second Great Awakening, same thing. However, it has a very similar effect, once again, of like democracy, power to the people. Like, hey, yeah, remember, it's still in your hands to save your soul. You have to do good deeds. And one way to do that is to, better society, help others around you. And so people feel like this Christian moral duty to, change society. And that's where we get all of the antebellum reform movements. Remember, antebellum reform movements, even though that means before the Civil War, they're not linked to the Civil War. That's why I don't like the naming of that. They're linked to the Second Great Awakening. They're an effect of that. Seneca Falls Convention. So one of those antebellum reforms with women's rights specifically is the Seneca Falls Convention. So this is basically the birthplace of modern feminism. It's the largest women's rights convention in history. It's in 1848, created by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they preached against the cult of domesticity, which is that belief that women should just be home. Ironically, it's like the Republican motherhood was so progressive at the time because it gave women a new status and role in society, which was very like forward at the time, but now these women are almost like complaining about that, saying like, no, we want more. They wrote the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions there, where they basically rewrote the Declaration of Independence, and every time it said man, they crossed off and wrote and woman. And they really advocated for suffrage. Like that was the main goal. It's still going to take a long time, almost 100 years after this, for that to really be realized. It's going to take World War I, but hey, gotta start somewhere. Oh, did I go backwards? Yes. All right. Manifest Destiny. All right. This is the belief that the U.S. had the God-given right to claim westward land in the name of spreading superior beliefs and civilization. So this is about expanding our westward borders, controlling all that westward land. It shows that idea of American exceptionalism, that we have the best and superior civilization, and so we should be spreading that. But yeah, this is the motivation for all of the things that we do out west. And you could see that in 54-40 fight in Oregon, that we were willing to go to war with Great Britain about getting more of Oregon and more into Canada. But it also prompted us to join or to get involved in the Mexican-American War. So let's talk about the Mexican-American War. All right, from 1846 to 1848, President Polk, very pro-expansionist president. Again, we could see that with the 50-40 fight, promoting a lot of westward expansion. He is the one who wasn't afraid and really on board also to annex Texas. He basically sparked the Mexican-American War because there was a discrepancy what was the southern border of Texas, and so he purposely sent military across the border into the disputed territory, knowing that would prompt Mexico to be upset and respond. And so he used their firing the first shot as justification for entering the war against them, because he knew if he could fight, he could win more of the Western land from them. And as a result, we won the Mexican Cession, which greatly increases the size of our nation. However, that land will open up the door for all the slave debates to come. Free soil movement. These are not abolitionists. This is a group that just wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery for different reasons. We discussed that a lot in that unit, that it's really easy for people just to think that all these people don't want slavery to continue, again, for moral reasons, but really it's more about like, if you free them, there's job competition, everything. So like they want to keep slavery as it is. They don't want to disrupt the Southern economy at all, because that could also have a ripple effect into the North. They just don't want it to expand because they don't want more slave states. Like they don't want more Southern Democrat representatives in Congress. And so the existence of this ideology validated the Southerners' fear, though, that Northerners like wanted to abolish slavery, and it definitely increases sectionalism and makes them more paranoid. Compromise of 1850. All right, so we got to deal with that Mexican Cession territory. So they decided California would be a free state. New Mexico and Utah would be utilize popular sovereignty, which means that the residents there would put it to a vote and majority wins. This also created the controversial fugitive slave law, meaning that if you see a runaway slave, you have to return it. Now, there is a fugitive slave law actually written into the Constitution, but it just wasn't really that enforced. This one is much more strict and punitive if you're caught not doing it. So why is this a big deal? It does open up the possibility of slavery expanding because it's based on popular sovereignty, but it really took the responsibility of deciding that off the shoulders of the government, because they didn't want to make the decision, because they knew it was like a powder keg and they didn't want to touch it. So they're like, whew, we can sidestep that by allowing them to decide, and our hands are clean of the situation. But this also makes the North very upset because of the fugitive slave law, because they were able to like comfortably ignore the issue of slavery, and now they have to focus on it. Now they're a part of it, and that's what pisses them off. Also with Uncle Tom's Cabin. So this is the bestseller at the time, right behind the Bible during this time period. This is written by Harry Beecher Stowe and depicts the life of a slave. And as this is circulating around the same time the Fugitive Slave Law is being passed, and it greatly increases the Northerners' sympathy for Southern slaves because now they can see how the life of a slave is actually depicted. I know it sounds silly, like how did you not know what it was like? But it's a different experience hearing more about it and when they were just kind of like out of sight, out of mind before. So pair this with the fugitive slave law. Another reason why there's like more passion about the fugitive slave law at the time. Election of 1860. So this is the final straw from the Southerners. This is when Abraham Lincoln, who has now been painted as a radical abolitionist, because right before that, when he was going for congressman in Illinois in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Stephen Douglas portrayed him because he was like one of those Northern Democrats, painted him as part of this new Republican Party as a radical abolitionist. And so while Lincoln was trying to make a name for himself, it was smeared as radical abolitionist, even though that was really not his whole jive. Like, he didn't really actually support slavery himself, but he didn't think it was his business to abolish it. And so when he was going to be president or running for president, the South was like, nope, not the radical abolitionist, but he won without a single vote from the South. And that led to the immediate secession of the deep Southern states. Fort Sumter. All right, so Lincoln has just been inaugurated and the deep South seceded, and there is a federal fort off the coast of South Carolina, in a southern state. So it's a federal fort, and Lincoln still believes that all the southern states are still within the Union. It's like a kid who ran away from home. It's like, no, you're still part of this family. I don't recognize the fact that you guys think you're going off and creating your own country right now. And so he decides to send provisions to the fort per usual. And so the South has to decide, are we going to let him send provisions there? Because it basically validates the fact that he owns it, that they're operating it, or we're going to stop it. And so they stop it. There's an attack at Fort Sumter. They attack the ship, and Lincoln is pissed. He's like, okay, I cannot stand for that. So he called for troops. He called, he authorized the for Congress to spend money for the war, and he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which again is violation of the Bill of Rights. So why do we care about this? Is because it's basically the first shots fired of the Civil War. It's like Lexington and Concord for the Revolution. But Lincoln's reaction to this, that crackdown, and him clearly about to use force against his own people, is what made the rest of the Upper South secede. Emancipation Proclamation. This was a strategic move made by Lincoln to liberate slaves only in the Confederacy. Cannot stress that enough. It is strategically only in the Confederacy because it will weaken the Confederacy, even though they're really not going to listen to it at all. There is another reason why it's a power move. So it's supposed to weaken the Confederacy. It keeps border states happy because these are Southern slave-owning states who are still within the Union, and we really don't want them to, rebel anymore, because some of them were like holding there forcefully. But it does make the war to the rest of the world firmly about slavery. This is not states' rights versus an oppressive government. It's about slavery. And in a time where the state is hoping to encourage Great Britain to come and, support their cause because, we're fighting our tyrannical government now. Great Britain was like, wait, you're telling me the war's about slavery? No, thank you. We abolished that a long time ago. And so it really prevents Great Britain from coming to their aid. Also sets the precedent for the 13th Amendment that will be passed after the war that will abolish slavery everywhere. Freedmen's Bureau. All right, this was created by the Radical Republicans during Reconstruction. Again, Radical Republicans' whole goal is to help the freed slaves and punish the South, like just pummel them into the dust. And so this agency was aimed at helping all the freed slaves find all the necessities they needed, and their biggest accomplishment was setting up thousands of schools for freed slaves across the country, because access to education will allow you to have more job opportunities. So why do we care about this? It kind of depends on who you're asking, because the Southerners see this as a gross abuse of federal power. And it creates a lot more tension between the North and the South and Democrats and Republicans. But it does set a precedent for the federal government being responsible for the welfare of its people, because now they're taking a stand on that. And also it's technically a stand on the issue of civil rights. Like, they're intervening in social and civil rights issues early on. Now, I know they're not going to do it for a while, basically in the next 100 years up until the civil rights movement. It's kind of weird as to why, because they're setting that precedent now, but it does set that precedent. Sharecropping. All right, so this is the contract labor system where people lived as tenants on a farm and did all the work for the owner. So basically, like if you're too poor to own your own farm, you can rent out a small piece of land from a larger farm, and then you basically have to pay them rent, which is basically all the money that you're ever getting. And so you're just perpetually in debt to the larger landowner. So it's not just African Americans who are in this spot. There are poor whites who are also sharecroppers, for sure. But this is what prevented African Americans from gaining any social mobility in society, because once they're free, Jim Crow laws at the time are, closing all the loopholes that could allow them to gain access to any other political or economic opportunities. Like you could be arrested if you didn't have a job or if you were a vagrant. And so it's like, all right, either get a job or go to jail. What are the only open positions? Especially when there's a law that says I can't own my own land. Well, I guess I have to go now become a sharecropper. And so this is the new form of servitude, because Johnson pardoned all the Southerners, gave all the Confederate leaders back their land, and this is new semi-bondage for the next 100 years. Homestead Act. All right, in 1962, so it was actually passed during the Civil War. It just wasn't greatly utilized until after the Civil War. It accelerated the settlement of the U.S. Western Territory by giving any American family 160 acres of free land as long as they agreed to work on the land. And again, we care about that because that rapidly increased westward settlement. A lot of this land was given to farmers, ranchers, miners. Those are like the three big demographics moving out there. But there's also railroad companies that were gifted a lot of land. And much of this land was taken by natives via the Dawes Act. Transcontinental Railroad. All right, we were just talking about railroads. So completed in 1869 at Promontory Point in Utah, it linked the Eastern Railroad and the Western lines, and it revolutionized transportation because it stretches across the continent. It links major cities and economies together. So it made it basically, again, one big national economy again, allows for cheaper, faster transportation. However, it did take land away from Native Americans and justifies pushing them out because of construction for this transportation network. And many were killed in the early stages of construction. Dawes Act. So we kind of briefly mentioned that before. So in 1887, this authorized the federal government to break up tribal lands by partitioning them into individual plots. Only those Native Americans who accepted the individual allotments were allowed to become U.S. citizens. The objective was to assimilate natives into mainstream U.S. society by annihilating, I was like alienating, but still their culture and their social traditions. I guess either word kind of works. So essentially the Dawes Act nullified any treaty that the federal government had previously signed with Native tribes and took all that land and redistributed it, gave a lot of it for the Homestead Act, and then put them in the crappiest land that is left that will eventually become the reservation system. It lays the foundation for that later on. But this just basically ended any kind of tribal recognition. It was purposely made to break them up and disperse them into hodgepodges of what used to be proud tribes into just disrupted, displaced tribes that were like warring with each other. Plessy v. Ferguson. All right, this is one of the landmark civil rights cases. Civil rights in the fact that it goes against it, but it's in that theme. It questioned if separate but equal accommodations for Black and white Americans violated the 14th Amendment, which says that everyone has equal protection under the law. And despite the 13th Amendment ending slavery and racial discrimination still persisted, is basically what this shows us. The Supreme Court ruled in favor that separate but equal facilities do not violate the 14th Amendment, and it gave the green light and stamp of approval to Jim Crow laws, and allowed them to exist for the next 60 years. So Jim Crow laws, like I said, allowed for sharecropping to be basically the only option for African Americans. It's those literacy tests, it's those poll taxes, it's the grandfather clause, it's all those things are Jim Crow laws. Actually, I forgot that was the next word, so I'm kind of already going into that. But like I said, it legitimized racial segregation. It's named after the black minstrel show character, Jim Crow, when they painted the face black. And so that basically defines the South post-Civil War era and Reconstruction onward, because radical Republicans became more enthralled with making money in the Second Industrial Revolution in the North than continuing to reconstruct the South. And so they abandoned the freed slaves. And so the Jim Crow laws basically went unchallenged until the Civil Rights movement. Second Industrial Revolution. All right, so this rapid industrialization in the late 19th, early 20th century, so late 1800s to early 1900s. Same idea as the first one. It's a difference in moving more towards machinery and technology, and from manufacturing and mass producing. This period of time is also known as the Gilded Age because for all the advancements, electricity, transportation, rapid urbanization, so making cities, there were a lot of negative impacts, some of which the next vocab words we'll talk about with labor, the environment, etc. But it does transform the U.S. into the modern marvel that it is today. Laissez-faire. So that's the mentality of the government during the Gilded Age, which meant that they would keep their hands off the economy. It was justified by social Darwinism, which is survival of the fittest, just applied to people. And this lack of intervention and oversight allowed for all the unethical business practices that we discussed, i.e. monopolies, political corruption, i.e. millionaires club, and how everyone in Congress was essentially backed by a monopoly because they would fund their campaigns and then they would pass or block laws that would benefit the companies that were lining their pockets. Bad working conditions, as seen in the jungle, in the meatpacking industry, environmental problems, child labor, you name it. Andrew Carnegie. So as one of the examples of industrialists at the time in the Gilded Age, he oversaw U.S. steel monopoly using vertical integration. Rockefeller was the other major one with oil and horizontal integration, both cutthroat business people. But he represented the rags to riches story of American exceptionalism, or like that Horatio Alger myth, which kept people thinking that if they just worked harder, they could do it. And we know that that is not necessarily true at this time. He also wrote The Gospel of Wealth, which said that rich people had an obligation to use their wealth to benefit society. And so depending on who you ask, is he a robber baron? Is he a captain of industry? Really depends. He did help physically build America with steel, but he could also be criticized for how he treated his workers, i.e. the Homestead strike with the Pinkertons. Haymarket bombing occurred on May 4th, 1886, when a labor protest rally near Chicago's Haymarket Square turned into an absolute riot after someone threw a bomb at the police. At least 8 people died as a result of the violence that day. Despite the lack of evidence against them, 8 radical labor activists were convicted in connection with the bombing. And again, whether they actually did it or not doesn't matter. That the Knights of Labor, who were the ones who were part of this rally, have now been associated with this anarchist radical behavior, and it really set the labor movement back a lot because that got applied to all unions as being seen as these radical organizations that people didn't trust and didn't want to be part of. American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. So we just want to focus on mentioned Knights of Labor, but one other labor union. This was run by Samuel Gompers. This labor union had more selective approach to membership by allowing only skilled and non-minority workers. Still around today, the AFL focused on a more narrow goal set, such as better wages and better working conditions, rather than the more broad and ambitious platforms in earlier unions like the Knights of Labor and the National Labor Union. So why do we care about them? That's the fact that they're still around today. Their work laid the foundation for many of the economic reforms that will be put forth and passed in the progressive era, and all of them that have to deal with like protecting workers' rights and limiting the powers of monopolies. New immigrants. So we talked about the first wave, or the old wave, with German and Irish earlier when we talked about nativism, but the second wave of immigrants that came over in the late 1800s, early 1900s during the second industrial revolution. So if you remember the first and second industrial revolution, you remember when the first and second wave of immigrants are, the old and new, because they come over during this time for economic opportunities. So this group was specifically from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, mainly China, and they were less able to assimilate than the previous groups. Because they are just culturally very different. They're coming from non-democratic, non-capitalist countries. They speak almost no English. They are very unskilled. They're very poor. Again, they're religiously different. They are physically different. And so there's a lot more discrimination against them. We see that with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's like the first major legislation to restrict immigration from a specific national origin. But they are a huge part of the workforce during the second industrial revolution, and they accelerated the growth of cities, and their presence will make the United States hesitant to enter World War I because we were fighting the countries that these people came from. Political machines, who also prey on immigrants. A party organization that recruits voter loyalty with tangible incentives and is characterized by a high degree of control over member activity using a boss. The most notable example is Boss Tweed of the Democratic Tammany Hall in New York City. So again, this is more of a local and state level type of corruption, where basically they just want the seat of power and they don't really care about bettering society. And so this is a result of the patronage and the graft of this time. It just shows the stalemate that is the Gilded Age. Social gospel. A movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which emphasized charity and social responsibility as a means of salvation. Do not get this confused with the gospel of wealth, which was all about Andrew Carnegie saying that wealthy people have an obligation to use their wealth to improve society. Social gospel is a religious movement that, they created the Salvation Army. It's kind of just a continuation of the Second Great Awakening idea that like Christian principles would lead you to want to better society. But this inspires a lot of the grassroots reformers in the progressive era, along with the Populist Party. So this is an agrarian or farmers-based movement that was preceded by the Farmers Alliance and the Grange movement and all those other farmers that were upset about all the other problems they're experiencing during the Gilded Age, by monopolies, by banks, by the government, by a climate, all that kind of stuff. And so the People's Party is kind of another word to call the Populist Party. It's a political party that was founded by these farmers. William Jennings Bryan was their candidate in the 1892 and 1896 presidential elections, and they gained a decent following for a third party, but they didn't win. So why do we care? Even though they did not win, their election totally shook up politics in the election of 1896. Basically because Republicans realized that the third party actually gained a lot of traction, and even in the last couple of elections, it was going back and forth between Democrat and Republican for like the first time since before the Civil War, and Republicans were like, oh, okay, crap. All right. So in order to gain power, I need to start listening to the people and addressing the problems that we see in society. And so this ended the stalemate that we see of the Gilded Age. It basically ended laissez-faire. And their Omaha platform gives a lot of the foundation that will be the progressive era reformers. Yellow journalism. So this is all the exaggerated journalism that you saw in the newspapers in the early 1900s. Examples are the reports of the atrocities that the Spanish were doing in Cuba against their natives because they've been trying to rebel and get freedom since European colonization. And then we see them talking about the Delome letter and how Spanish were bad-mouthing our president. And then the claims that they blew up the USS Maine outside of the Havana Harbor in Cuba. And again, doesn't matter that ended up being false later, but as soon as newspapers reported these exaggerated accounts, it inflamed public opinion so much, they basically called the president, President McKinley, to go to war. And so it basically was a cause of the Spanish-American War almost in its entirety. So, Spanish-American War. So in 1898, this is a conflict between the United States and Spain that ended the Spanish colonial rule in the Americas because now they basically lost all their colonies and resulted in the U.S. acquisition of territories all around the world, but specifically the Western Pacific and Latin America, as we gained them in the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Or sorry, yeah, it should say 1898. I mixed up those numbers. 1898. This showed America's willingness to break the precedent of isolationism for two reasons. One, in the name of freedom, and two, possibility of gaining land or imperialism. So once again, anytime we break our precedent of neutrality or isolationism, what historians want to know is like, why? What was clearly so important that you had to do that? And so it shows us what America values and what it's willing to risk to get that. And those are the two reasons that we can see here. And the land gained here made it possible for the United States to enter that new level of being like a first-class imperialist nation. Anti-Imperialist League. Created by William Jennings Bryan, this group formed in opposition to the imperialism of the United States seen in the debate of the annexation of the territories we acquired from the Spanish-American War. Mainly the annexation of the Philippines is like the biggest debate here. So this group represents the debate about America's role in the world, our foreign policy, and our negative impact on our other nations. And these nations clearly do not like us there. You could see that in how the Filipinos rebelled with Emilio Aguinaldo. You saw this in the Boxer Rebellion in China. Because and going back to Cuba, we saw like the Platt Amendment, and basically that just means that we have so much oversight in Cuba that it's not even funny. So yeah, the anti-imperialist league just kind of represents all that debate. Open door policy. See, these are there's notes set between the United States and all the other imperialist European nations that are occupying spheres of influence in China, where like all these nations have like a little zone that they pour money into and build up the industry in that area and reap the benefits out of China. Again, China will have the last because when everyone abandons their section, China has just been industrialized, invested in by all these other countries. But basically he was just saying like, hey, can we get everyone to agree on open trading rights in China? And even though no one responded to the note, no one challenged us starting to create our own sphere of influence in China. Um, and it doesn't really last very long, but it shows America's growing imperialist efforts and the different techniques we use to grow our influence. Like this is one of them. Going to war is one. Buying Alaska is another one. Big stick diplomacy. All right, this is an imperialist foreign policy used by Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, where he asserted we should be diplomatic but use militant or aggressive actions if need be. So speak quietly or speak softly, but carry a big stick. Example of this would be the Panama Canal incident, Great White Fleet sailing around the world, his participation in the Russo-Japanese War, all those things. This type of stance increased America's influence and prestige, like our respect on the world stage for sure. But it did lead to an increase in focus and reliance on American military. So that could be, again, a good or bad thing for some people, but possibly that the fact that we just built up our military in the name of imperialism is what, and for all nations, makes them more prepared to fight World War One. Square deal. Another progressive era reform by Teddy Roosevelt, where both labor and management would be treated equally, unlike in the Gilded Age, when they always sided with management in all the strikes. So an example of this would be when Roosevelt invited the anthracite coal miner strike and owners to the White House for mediation, and they hashed out a compromise. This set the precedent the federal government will be much more involved in reforming society, that bully pulpit mentality that Roosevelt had, where he should be like reforming society and coming up with the agenda of like what he sees as wrong and what we should do next. And it also empowered labor unions. It kind of got their mojo back. Sherman Antitrust Act, a law passed by Congress in 1890 that was designed to combat the monopolies that were running rampant in American business. However, this was purposely worded way too vaguely because this is the Republicans at the time in Congress who like want to appear like they're doing something after the election with like, or like during the time with like with populists, and the Democrats are kind of going back and forth and like they're kind of losing steam. But they don't actually want to limit business because they're benefiting from it. And so later this will be fixed, but again, not super effective and just not really enforced. Unrestricted submarine warfare. One of the major causes of both World War I and World War II, in both causes, the German uses their U-boats against their, which is like their submarines, against their enemies, and the United States is impacted in a bunch of different ways. Either we get caught in the crossfire with different attacks, like the Lusitania, or we're being blockaded. Like they're using their submarine to like prevent other area or like other countries from like docking in the Allied powers area, where like now that it impacts our trade relations with them, and we don't like that. So again, one of the major reasons why the United States broke its precedent of neutrality and isolationism and will enter both World War I and World War II. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, a civil rights organization founded in 1909 to fight prejudice, lynching, and Jim Crow segregation, and to work for the betterment of people of color. W.E.B. Du Bois founded it, one of the most prominent groups for African American civil rights that fought against de facto and de jure segregation. They're still prominent today. Committee on Public Information. This organization, created by the federal government during World War I, controlled which info the public was privy to. So basically, gate kept everything. They churned out propaganda to encourage people to do their part for the quote unquote the good war, and made enlisting, rationing, canning your goods, buying savings bonds, everything in between patriotic and heroic. And also just like gave everyone, or like kept going with like the rallying against the enemy. Again, this will be brought back in World War II, but it's the Committee of War Information. So just change the word public to war, and it's also in chronological order as it is in alphabetical order. This huge machine of propaganda sustained public support and morale, and therefore kept us meeting the wartime demands. We can see how important it is because you can flash forward to like Vietnam when we don't have this, and you can see how public support and morale is very much needed to sustain a war effort. Treaty of Versailles. It was created to solve the problems made by World War I. However, it didn't really actually address any. Germany was forced to accept the treaty. It was composed of only four of the original 14 points made by President Woodrow Wilson. The treaty punished Germany and did nothing to stop the threat of future wars and maintained the pre-war power structure. So again, essentially, this will cause World War II as it humiliated Germany in front of the entire world by making them agree to the war guilt clause, crippled their military, ruined their economy with war reparations to France and Great Britain. It did not honor Wilson's peace without victory because it made losers out of them. And it also created and reshaped countries throughout Europe, which creates a lot of anti-American or anti-imperialist nation sentiment in those areas. American Expeditionary Forces, U.S. ground forces sent to the Western Front in Europe during World War I that had been stalemated for years between the Allied and Central Powers. One of the ways that the United States had made the difference in winning World War I by breaking through that stalemate and pushing out the Germans back out of the Western Front, out of France. So again, this is how we made the difference on land. At sea was like the convoy system. The weapons were also supplied, or the weapons supplied in this case also showcased the might of going up against an industrial capitalist nation. Great Migration. One of the largest internal population movements within American history. It's a mass amount of African Americans moving from the South to northern cities in the early 1900s to escape the Jim Crow South if they can. It provided a new workforce for northern industries, especially during World War I, when a lot of those places are vacated because men are going off and fighting in war. It reconfigured demographics around the country. It also gave African Americans more opportunities for expression, such as the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s. Quota laws. After World War I, these laws restricted how much of the U.S. population was foreign-born. This was a sign of growing nativism fighting the Central Powers, where many of these new immigrants were from, job competition from men returning from war, and the Red Scare. So those three issues of nativism, the Red Scare, and labor union, like the fear of unions, are all tied together because like unions look very communistic, and immigrants are job competition, but immigrants could also be bringing over thoughts of communism. So all those post-war 1920 fears are all linked together. Stock market crash. On Black Tuesday, 1929, the bubble burst and the stock market crashed due to the roaring but unstable post-World War I economy due to easy credit from banks, consumer culture, overproduction by businesses, lack of government oversight, and buying on margin, buying stocks with money that people do not have. It caused the Great Depression, the worst economic turmoil in American history, mass homelessness, unemployment, despair, and distrust with the federal government. The New Deal. When FDR was elected in 1932, during the Great Depression, he said he had a new deal for the American public to get them out of the Great Depression. It was based on his 3 R's: relief to the people, recovering businesses, and reforming to make sure this never happens again. And it was rooted in that prime the pump mentality, meaning that the government has to do deficit spending, got to spend money to make money. They're going to go into extreme amounts of debt to jumpstart that economy. Kind of priming that pump where you have to kind of push and push and push before the water can come out. The government's putting in all the work. So it does alleviate some of the effects of the Great Depression, but it definitely does not resolve it. That will be World War II. Created many jobs, but put the federal government in tremendous debt with deficit spending. It discriminated against minorities like the FHA, redlining African Americans. So not everyone was helped. And it was greatly criticized by conservatives for creating the welfare state, where the government is essentially responsible for the welfare of its citizens and creating like people being too dependent on the government. Appeasement. The foreign policy informally adopted by the League of Nations as Hitler began to take over nearby land in the 30s and 40s. When the Allied powers met Hitler in Munich, they agreed to let him keep the lands he had occupied so far, like the Rhineland and Sudetenland, but as long as he didn't take any more. So appeasement is kind of synonymous with that Munich agreement. This was an absolutely terrible idea because Hitler totally took advantage of the lack of commitment of the League of Nations and their fear of causing World War II to invade Poland, and then that's what started World War II. Neutrality Acts. Series of acts passed by Congress in response to Hitler's growing power and failure of appeasement. So it stated that the United States would not trade or support any belligerent at-war nation. The United States learned from their past mistakes of how we got dragged into World War I because we were so financially tied to the success of the Allied powers. We loaned them billions of dollars, and we were selling them so many weapons. We were making money off of them that we got so closely tied to them that it made us feel more obligated to join to make sure that they were winning, because if they lost, how in the world are we going to pay back our loans? And so basically we just like want to stay out of it totally. So the neutrality acts are so strict in like we are so neutral, ultra neutral. We're not going to even trade with anyone that's at war right now, or with weapons specifically. We're not going to do that. And it was passed even before anyone formally declared war. Pearl Harbor. In 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This event changed public attitude overnight from being anti to pro-war. The United States immediately declared war on Japan and Germany, or Japan and Germany declared war on us in response. So we're in it. Double V campaign. A campaign by African Americans to encourage each other to enlist and do their part in World War II, because while they fight to defeat fascism abroad, they can defeat racism at home by doing their part and proving they have a part in society. So their participation in World War II gave more weight to the civil rights arguments that will begin in the 1950s after the war ends for us in 1945. Rosie the Riveter, a female icon created by the Office of War Information during World War II to illustrate women doing industrial jobs that were vacated by men fighting abroad. So she's meant to encourage women to take these roles that are traditionally filled by men, but it also increases women's status in society and will, again, just give more weight to the fact that women deserve more political rights. Selective Service Act. Passed during World War I and World War II, that should say, a draft, also known as conscription. This raises an army to fight in both wars, so it helps make the difference of winning. When it is passed during World War II, though, it's notably more controversial because it was passed before the United States had actually entered the war. So it was the first peacetime draft, and some people saw that as an abuse of power, i.e. Eugene Debs. Japanese internment. President Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, passed the Executive Order 906X, which resulted in the relocation over 100,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast into internment camps during World War II. Japanese Americans sold their businesses and houses for a fraction of their value before being sent to these camps. So basically, they lost their entire livelihoods and much of their life savings. This was upheld in the Supreme Court case of Korematsu v. United States in 1944. So once again, it kind of shows that like that loophole of like you're arguing it's because of like clear and present danger to the United States that you're upholding public safety, that you have to violate the Bill of Rights, and the constitutionality of this. Again, it's upheld by the Supreme Court because of that. In 1988, the United States will issue an apology for the internment, and compensation for survivors will be given because of the violation of civil liberties. Island hopping. The strategy used by the United States to inch closer to Japan. I don't know what I spelled there. When the United States won Iwo Jima and Okinawa, we are officially close enough to drop the atomic bomb because that can only be in the air for so long. So we need to get proximity is kind of the name of the game there. Manhattan Project, the U.S. project to develop the atomic bomb. This technological invention made it possible for the United States to swiftly end World War II, also introduced a whole new reality of warfare to the rest of the world, nuclear weapons. Yalta Conference. One of the post-war conferences between the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, where it was decided that the Soviet Union would enter the fight against Japan, even though we don't want them to. They would divide and occupy Germany into 4 zones. Eastern Europe would have free elections once everyone left, and all that stuff. Basically motivated the United States to drop the atomic bomb because we don't want the Soviet Union to get involved. All of these things that were agreed upon were not upheld by the Soviets and will be causes for the Cold War. United Nations. The international peacekeeping organization created after World War II, replacing the League of Nations, where all nations are eventually invited to join, helps to prevent future world conflicts, a sign that everyone learned their mistakes from World War I. Satellite states. Eastern European nations whose free elections post-World War II were meddled in by the Soviet Union to ensure that communist leaders won that were loyal to Stalin. These would be part of the Eastern Bloc of the Cold War. Their creation motivated Winston Churchill to give his famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe, basically calling out the mental and ideological, or the physical and ideological divide that separates the Western democracies from the Eastern communists. And that speech prompted the democracies of the world to mobilize against the Soviet Union. Containment. The foreign policy that the United States followed for the entirety of the Cold War to contain communism and to not let it spread beyond the Eastern Bloc. Each president will have their own way of going about containment. It will just change and be molded by the lessons learned along the way. But containment will be the underlying motivation for everything the United States does for the next 50 years until it ends in the 90s. And then we have the New World Order. Marshall Plan. In 1947, the United States gave billions of dollars to Europe to help rebuild post-war societies, mainly raw materials, underlying purpose to prevent the spread of communism. Soviets attempt to imitate this, but it doesn't work. We offered them money for the partial plan, but the Soviets would not let them or the satellite states take it. This is the manifestation of the Truman Doctrine that upheld the containment policy, but this is using like an economic way of going about it by saying that any European nation that's struggling against communism will give you money to help stabilize, because it worked with Greece and Turkey initially, and because we're like, oh yeah, that worked, let's apply that to everywhere. And that's the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Brinkmanship. The strategy of pushing other nations to the edge of war in hopes that they will back out due to fear of mutually assured destruction, also known as dual diplomacy, which started under President Eisenhower. This tactic relies heavily on having bigger and better weapons to deter the other nations from engaging in the fight, which leads to the unwinnable arms race. Military-industrial complex. Also under Eisenhower. It's kind of like the opposite end of brinkmanship, because he started the arms race. An informal alliance between the nation's military and its defense industries, like businesses that create weapons, which supplies it. The goal is to gain political support for the increased military spending by the national government. President Eisenhower first used this term in his farewell address in 1961, where he said, I feel like I just created this with the arms race, that I've created this unhealthy relationship between military and industry. Like our economy is bolstered by being at war, and that's an unhealthy precedent to set. So these intertwined interests influence foreign policy and government actions in the future. People still critique that we are this today. Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the Soviet provision of ballistic missiles to Cuba led to the most dangerous Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union and brought the world almost to the brink of war. Nuclear annihilation was almost a reality. Over the course of an extremely tense 14 days, JFK and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev negotiated finally a peaceful outcome to the crisis. The crisis really sobered both sides. Realizing the nuclear annihilation was almost a possibility and the dangers of brinkmanship mentality. And so it stopped not stopped, but it slowed the arms race. We adopted a more flexible response policy, set up a hotline between the two nations, and prompted the creation of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy produced a series of investigations and hearings during the 1950s in an effort to expose possible communists infiltrating throughout influential organizations in the United States. His name is pretty much synonymous with like defamation and unfounded accusations and just witch hunts. So this greatly increased paranoia for possible communists during the Red Scare, justified the increase in government oversight and regulation. And you can see that with HUAC, and McCarran Internal Security Act, Sedition Act, all that kind of stuff. Baby boom. The rapid increase in birth rate in the mid to late 1940s as a result of the strong post-war economy in which Americans felt confident they'd be able to support a large number of children. Boomers also influenced the economy as a core marketing demographic for products tied to their age group, from toys to records. So again, all that post-war 1950s economy. But because of their huge demographic pull, as those kids grow up, they age into the demographic that's like petitioning in the 50s and 60s and 70s social movements. And so their participation, because of their numbers, is so important. Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, a unanimous Supreme Court declared that the racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. The court declared that separate but equal educational facilities are inherently unequal. So this overturns Plessy v. Ferguson and sets the precedent for integration everywhere eventually. Civil Rights Act of 1964. So this banned discrimination in all public accommodations in all public places, and enlarged federal powers to promote or protect voting rights and to speed up school desegregation. This and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 helped to give African Americans equality on paper and more federally protected power so that social equality was actually more of a realistic goal. Montgomery bus boycott. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a Black seamstress, was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama for refusing to give her seat to a white passenger on the bus. So her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, during which the Black citizens of Montgomery refused to ride the city's buses in protest over the bus system's policies of racial segregation. It was the first mass action of the modern civil rights era and served as an inspiration to other civil rights activists across the nation. This is basically where Martin Luther King gains notoriety and starts to endorse nonviolent actions and preaches that. He starts to form this SCLC in response to this. And that's really where the civil rights movement is born. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Formed in the 1960s, it focused on mobilizing local communities, especially college students, to protest racial injustices. CORE and SNCC work closely together along with the NAACP and the SCLC in the civil rights movement. And they are involved in sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives, and the March on Washington. So this kind of consistent and visible nature of their protests raises awareness for the civil rights movement. And visible meaning like it's televised, a lot of these things. Black and white college students working together also helps bridge the racial gap. Domino theory. Believe that if one nation fell to communism, that nearby nations would as well. This idea was applied to Southeast Asian countries in the 1950s and 60s. The justification that JFK needed basically to send non-combat military to support Vietnam, and LBJ will use this along with the attack on the Gulf of Tonkin, to escalate even further. Tonkin Gulf Resolution, or a Gulf of Tonkin, however you want to call it. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorized President Lyndon B. Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression by the communist government in North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. So in 1964, that was passed, And the US Congress basically gave the president a blank check as commander-in-chief of the military to do whatever he felt was necessary. And he amassed and used all of that power to his benefit. Great society. So this is a really ambitious series of social reforms and initiatives by LBJ. It is one of the largest social reform programs in American history, and social reform, because like New Deal is more economic reform. So this is like the largest social reform platform. And its biggest claim to fame was the war on poverty. And a lot of these programs are still around today. They will help in the long term, but in the short term, they get really disrupted due to Vietnam. Students for a Democratic Society, or SIDS. Radical leftist student organization that began in the United States in the mid-60s. SIDS advocated for student power through direct action, and they were actively campaigning against Vietnam. Part of the New Left movement, like, so this is a manifestation of the New Left and the free speech movement. They also represent the disillusionment amongst society with the federal government due to the credibility gap. Credibility gap. This was the gap between people and the government that grew because of the misinformation or the lack of information that was being given about Vietnam, as well as Watergate, and just this feeling of inability to help society throughout the 50s, or sorry, I guess late 50s, 60s, and 70s. So people became less inclined to buy into the government's actions, and why you see so many people today still questioning the government and why they feel so distrustful. Détente. Nixon's phrase for a deliberate reduction in the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 70s. One of the big ways he accomplished this was visiting Mao in China. He was the first president since they became the Communist People's Republic of China that he went to go visit, and basically reinstated our recognition of China. His ability to leverage his goodwill with China to get the Soviets to come to the table kind of opened up that door to better communication and relations with them. So while there was a controversial move to go see Mao, he was able to use that to his advantage and got all parties to agree to SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, where everyone agreed to lessen their ABMs, or their anti-ballistic missiles, which would seem kind of a beginning of the end of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan. TV actor turned president when he was elected in 1980, Christian conservative who believed in tax cuts and less government spending, both of which kind of combines to also be called Reaganomics. Cut out a lot of welfare programs in the name, cutting government spending, and believed in being tough on foreign policy, which you can see with his Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. So why do we care about Reagan? His meetings with Gorbachev were the first steps to ending the Cold War. So both of them, Gorbachev being the benevolent leader in the Soviet Union, is really, again, like the beginning of the end. Responsible for the Iran-Contra affair, which created a lot of anti-government feelings at home and anti-US feelings abroad. And his Reaganomics system, while it did improve the economy in a lot of ways, it depends on what metrics you look at, because in some other metrics, like our debt and the health of the lower and middle class, not everyone benefited. September 11th, 2001. Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda launched a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon. Thousands of Americans and first responders lost their lives in the largest domestic terrorist attack on American soil. This changed and redefined U.S. foreign policy for the next 20 years as it began the war on terror. It justified the U.S. entering the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction. Also known as WMDs, are weapons of mass destruction, or repetitive, tired. Weapons that are capable of wiping societies off the face of the earth, typically nuclear in essence. President George W. Bush was convinced that Iraq had these and used these as justification for Operation Iraqi Freedom, where we went in, overthrew Saddam Hussein, and took over control of the government. Ironically, we could not find weapons of mass destruction, but we don't know how to bow out, which leads to us being present in Iraq for the next 20 years. Globalization. Globalization refers to the process by which technological, economic, political, and cultural exchanges make the world a more interconnected and interdependent place. Spurred by the rise of internet, the examples are like the World Trade Organization, the G8, all those other groups. The effect of globalization has been uneven, with different societies benefiting or not. But it, basically just creates one what's people call global village, like this feeling that the world is more interconnected than ever before. And that's it. Those are the top 100 words that you'll need to know for APUSH. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck on your test.